It's around 1000 BC. A young boy stands before a heavily armored Philistine giant. This single encounter will decide the fate of a major battle between the Jews and Philistines. In our world, the young boy, David, kills the giant Goliath with a sling. The Jews win the battle, and David rises as the first major king of the Jews, uniting them and crushing the Philistines. However, what if this single battle had gone differently? What would borders be like? How about culture? That is the question of this alternate history. First things first, this battle may have never happened. It comes from the book of Samuel in the Bible, and the only evidence is legendary. We are entirely certain that David did exist, however, and there's nothing inherently implausible about the story if you use the translations from the original Hebrew that make Goliath 6'9" instead of 9 feet tall, and even that's probably an exaggeration. So why not have a little fun here, and imagine what the very real historical ramifications of said battle would be. If that's too extreme for you guys, just imagine this is a what if King David was never born alternate history. I got this idea from trying to figure out what the single most decisive second in history was, and I came to the conclusion this was it. This alternate history starts slow and then builds up like an avalanche to create a hugely different world. Before we start moving into this different world, let's solidify our knowledge of what David and Goliath's world looked like. 150 years earlier, the advanced Bronze Age civilizations like the Hittites, Mitanni, and New Kingdom Egypt collapsed. The world was still steeped in the following Dark Age. The Levant region, or modern-day Israel, was inhabited by many separate peoples. In the interior there were the Jews, desert tribes who came out of the Arabian desert 200 years earlier. Philistines, Greek and probably Italian pirates who settled down in the coast near Egypt, various Semitic peoples like Ammon, Moab, Edom, who I and basically no one else has any idea what their history or what their story is, and, surprisingly, colonies of Hittites who kept going 150 years after their main part of their empire collapsed. The Jews were locked into war with the Philistines of the coast. In our timeline, the boy David, after killing Goliath, actually became a Philistine mercenary, but then returned to his homeland and united the Jewish tribes into a single kingdom. He then grew the kingdom, wiping out the Philistines as an important force, and conquering the neighboring regions, thus effectively turning the entire Levantine region into a Jewish empire. None of this would have happened in this timeline. Without David's leadership, the Jews would have never united. It's hard to say if the battle in of itself would be historically decisive, because there's so much legend around it, and it's hard to say what's true. But the legend says that Saul was trying to rise one of the kings of the Jews, and Goliath challenged him to mortal combat to delegitimize him, and David agreed to fight in Saul's stead because Saul refused to fight. And so, an alternate ending to the battle could have resulted in the delegitimization of Saul, and thus the weakening of central Jewish power. Truth be told, if I was a geopolitical analyst in 1000 BC, I would have far sooner bet my money on the Philistines and the Jews. The Jews were divided desert tribes holding the least fertile land in the region. The Philistines were meanwhile wealthy city-states with strong handicrafts production. The Philistines were much more militarily advanced as well, with usage of chariots, the tanks of the day, and iron weapons, while the Jews were barely beyond stone weapons. This means that, really without David's leadership, the Jews would have not become the ascendant force in the region. It's ironic that we use the term Philistine to mean culturally ignorant, even though the Philistines made much better art than the Jews. But hey, history is written by the guys who found world-spanning religions. We probably would have seen the Philistines solidify their power over the region. The interior of the region controlled by the Jews was economically irrelevant, and so, for the most part, would be ignored by the Philistines. The Jews would become an unimportant group of tributary peoples. Without David, Judaism would have taken a very different route. Without unification, the Jewish identity would have never really come into existence. Solomon created the temple at Jerusalem and made it the center of Jewish culture. The religion that came out of the centralized Jewish kingdom was the religion of Judaism as we understand it today. In David's day, the religion was not monotheistic, with Yahweh being one god among a couple, including a fat fertility goddess who was later suppressed because she was too similar to the Mesopotamian Ishtar, and many nature spirits, or Baals, that they received from the native Canaanites, who were probably still the majority of the population. The central government was able to enforce a central version of Judaism that was the basis for later Christianity and Islam. The religion of Judaism is the main reason the Jews are still around. People stayed Jewish after millennia of oppression, pogroms, and genocides because of the faith passed down from their ancestors. When we look at a map of the Middle East in this era, we find that the only other peoples who have survived are the Urartans, the ancestors of the Armenians, and the Assyrians are still a downtrodden minority in Iraq. If you told the 1000 BC geopolitical analyst version of me that in 3000 years that the Jews were still around but the Egyptians weren't, I'd tell you the Egyptians were terrible fighters and deserved it. But if you said the same thing with the Phoenicians or Edomites, I'd call you insane. Without the central Jewish faith and the temple culture, there's literally no way that the Jewish culture could have survived. In this timeline, over centuries, Jewish culture ceases to exist and they assimilate into a general Canaanite Philistine-ish blend like everyone else in the region. People often forget the Philistines were basically Greeks, and the chaos involved in the collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations. Many Greeks, alongside peoples called the Sea Peoples, who were probably Italians and probably some Europeans even further west, raided the region and settled on the shores of the Levant. It's entirely possible that Goliath's great-great-grandfather fought at Troy. Thus the Philistines had developed into a pseudo-Greek society. We often forget that in the ancient world, far more Greeks lived outside of the borders of modern Greece than in it. The Greek colonies in Asia Minor and Italy were at times wealthier than the Greek homeland. Herodotus referred to the Greeks as like frogs around a pond, hugging the sea everywhere. Meanwhile, there were a ring of states under serious Greek cultural influence, such as Lydia and Phrygia and Turkey, the island of Cyprus, the kingdom of Thrace in the Balkans, and some states in Italy. The Philistines become part of this greater Greece. This would change the balance of power. The Greeks were competing for control over the Mediterranean with the Phoenicians. Having the Levant be under Greek influence would result in the Greeks gaining control over the regions, and especially neighboring Egypt's maritime trade. This would give them a strong hand over the Phoenicians in the later years and make them wealthier. The cultural connections would also result in more intercourse with the Greek homeland, meaning that Greeks would pull out of their own Dark Age earlier. The Assyrians and Babylonians would still conquer the region. This part of the world is practically designed for big empires and has had them since practically the dawn of time. Small nations like the Jews, Philistines, Phoenicians, and sadly my guys the Edomites were only able to survive because the main centers of civilization were at a dark age at the time. These conquests would result in a cultural melting pot in the region in which all the local cultures would meld under the larger foreign control. The Philistine Greek culture would survive for hundreds of years in the same way the Phoenician culture in Lebanon did, and the Greeks maintained their culture in Asia Minor for centuries of Persian rule. However, the Assyrian conquest would result in an exodus of Philistines across the Greek world. Many would go to the western Greek colonies and areas in modern France, Spain, and Libya. This would be like how the Assyrian conquest of the Phoenician homeland resulted in an exodus of Phoenicians to the colony of Carthage in modern Tunisia. The combination of the wealth from the control of the Levantine and Egyptian trade routes and the movement of talent to the western colonies would mean that the Greeks would become the dominant force in the western Mediterranean rather than the Carthaginians. Some Greek city, probably Massilia in southern France, or Syracuse in Italy, would become the dominant force in the region. This could have easily resulted in straining the Roman Republic in its cradle, since all these cities are significantly closer to Rome than Carthage is, and they might have been worried by the aggressiveness of that little state. Perhaps the Greeks would have become the dominant empire in the region, building a cultural empire stretching from the Atlantic to India, while northern Europe would have remained under the Celts. The Jews were really not an important force in the region for a very long time. Thus, we can expect the politics of the Near East to not be that different. The Persians would still forge their empire, and Alexander the Great would still carve out a mighty domain. The first real evidence we would see of change would be that of the Jewish Maccabee revolt, would never have defeated the Seleucids and carved out their own independent kingdom in the region. The uncertainty of the Roman Empire's existence makes predicting the geopolitical events of this alternate history impossible beyond a certain point. The Roman Empire is so central to the entire history of the world that it kind of trolls the rest of this alternate history. However, the primary effects of this alternate history are not political, they're religious. Judaism spawned the other Abrahamic religions like Islam and Christianity that combined to make up more than half of mankind. Without Judaism, what would fill that vacuum? This was the Axial Age, when all the major civilizations in Eurasia had great religious shifts, so something would have arrived, but there are countless options. The Middle East quickly turned Zoroastrian, the official religion of the Persian Empire that venerates fire and is based around the endless battle between good and evil. In Europe, it depends a huge amount upon who's in power, the Greeks or the Romans. There were attempts in our timeline to turn Greek beliefs into an axial-age religion, introducing concepts like monks and heaven, so maybe that would have worked in this alternate history. If the Roman Empire still exists, I stand by the point I've always stood by, that Mithraism, another Persian cult that venerated masculine virtue, alongside the bull and sun, would dominate Europe. Perhaps the native Celtic and Germanic gods would dominate in changed forms, or maybe even Stoicism. I really have no idea. I'm sorry I can't have any better guesses, but we're in fantasy writer territory here rather than historian. It's difficult to push this alternate history any further for the previous reasons. Technology, culture, and practically all other fields would be further behind in this timeline. The Jews have added disproportionately in every field they've been in. For example, Jews make up less than 1% of the world's population, but from 1900 to 1950, won 14% of Nobel Science Prizes, and from 1951 until 2000, won 29% of Nobel Literature Prizes. Or just look at what Jews have accomplished in America in the last few decades. They've had Henry Kissinger, Mel Brooks, Bob Dylan, Woody Allen, Gloria Steinem, an important figure in the feminist movement, and Jerry Seinfeld among their number, alongside less famous but equally important figures like Jonas Salk, who invented the polio vaccine. The Jews have been some of the best merchants almost everywhere and anywhen they've been. Without these contributions adding up, civilization would be less colorful and advanced. What if Altist? Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed that video, please comment, subscribe, support me on Patreon, stay tuned for future content, or tell a friend. As always, thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this video.